It's 5 sharp. I guess we can start.
5 sharp, yeah.
So welcome everybody. We're going to start perfectly in time so that we can try to finish also perfectly in time. This is our first meeting. I am Vincenzo Pietrogiovanni. I'm an associate professor in labor law, active between Sweden and Denmark, and I'm starting this moderation or chairing of this meeting, and I will be joined soon by 2 other members of the Moving Labor Collective Organizing Committee, Andrea Iossa, who is not far from here actually, and Fotis, Vergis, who is very much far away from Sweden. So today is the first meeting of a series of online events, 4 different webinars. So my task as a host is just to briefly introduce you to the collective that I modestly represent in this occasion, and then give you a few thoughts about why another webinar, why another online seminars, what is the purpose, what we aim for. So as a moving labor collective, we've been active in the last couple of years. We are 11 people from international universities, and we gathered 3 years ago in order to start a new way of doing research, or start a new way of doing research in labor law, bringing non-mainstreaming approaches to labor law, but also acting, doing something concrete that is not common, at least not anymore in the labor law scholarship. And one of the biggest, at least socially speaking, event that we organize is the summer camp. Every second year in southern Italy, in Puglia, the region where I come from, we organize a summer camp that it's not a conference, it's not even meant to be a conference, but it's actually an event of 3-4 days where we do readings, we do presentations, we share reflections, but we also do something. From social activities, but also to other sorts of collaborations, form of collaborations. And we try also to engage with the territory we chose to as a host by inviting labor activists, trade unionists from that part of southern Italy. As you might expect, it's a biannual event. So the very first time we did it was in 2018. And of course, this year we were expecting to run the 2nd edition, but the pandemic forced us to move it to next year. And we started to feel that this will create a void in the activities of our collective. By no means we try to replace a summer camp with this series of seminars, but somehow we felt the urgency to react to what is happening. Before I move on and give the floor to Andrea, who is going to moderate this first round of interventions, I would like just to give you the outline of this seminar. It's going to last a couple of hours. We will have a first round of interventions from our panelists that Andrea is going to introduce. Then we will have a second round of interventions. And then about in 55 minutes, we will open up the floor for questions and answers. I kindly ask you to mute yourself in order to avoid strange noises and feedback. And you can somehow register yourself for questions by using the chat that you can find on the bottom of your Zoom link. That's all for me. So thanks again for coming in. I see people, attendees, the number of participants is growing constantly. Thanks again, and Andrea, please.
Yeah, right after Fotis asked me to unmute myself, I have to mute myself, I have to unmute myself. Anyway, thanks Vincenzo for the introduction. I will be extremely brief because I think that it's important that we give the floor to our speakers as soon as possible for as long as possible. I just want to say one thing, which is that to me, this is really a key. This event, this seminar, represents the core aim of our collective, which is to gather researchers and activists in order to discuss common issues from complementary perspectives. So I think that for us, it's listening to the voices of labor and union organizers is the key to understand the path, the direction that academic research has to take, and I think that to build this bridge between research and activists, it's important to make research useful for activism and also to make activism inspiring the research that we as researchers we have to do. So starting from this, I mean, I won't say more than what Vincenzo has already said about the impact that the pandemic, the COVID-19 outbreak has had on the world of work. Because, I mean, again, I think that we will listen to very interesting stories, views, perspectives, and experiences from our speakers, which I will now introduce finally. So first we have Daria Bogdanska from the Malmö branch of the Swedish syndicalist union SAC, who has been working for several years in organizing migrant workers in the restaurant and bar sectors, as well as in the agricultural sector. I would like also to say that she's a very talented cartoonist, and she has published a graphic novel, which is called Wage Slave, in which she describes her life as a migrant worker in Malmö and also her work as an activist, as a labor organizer in Malmö again. And the book has been also translated in several languages, including French, Italian, for instance. So I warmly suggest all of you to read it. Then we have Dora Chrysikou, who's an actress and has been, and there's also a lot of experience in social and labor activism. She has organized collective actions and initiatives in the art sector. She's been actively engaged in social movements and initiatives related to the protection of migrants, the LGBTQ community, prisoners, and also during the pandemic, she's been working on an initiative called Support Art Workers, which are also like a category of workers that is always which has been under the spotlight in this situation. Then we have Valentina Orazzini, who's the responsible for the European department of FIOM, which is the largest trade union organization in Italy that represents white and blue collar metal workers and is affiliated with CGIL. And in her work, Valentina deals with international and European dimension of trade unionism, and she's also been active in transnational social movements such as Blockupy. So it would be also interesting to reflect probably on the possibility to repeat a transnational movement like that. And then we have Dave Smith, who's a construction union activist, secretary of the Blacklist support group. He is a co-author of the book Blacklist, the secret war between big business and union activists, that tells us about the strategies that construction companies have to keep unionized workers and union activists away from workplaces. He also has conducted the research at the University of West of England on the topic of union organizing among construction workers. And last, but of course not least, we have the pleasure to have also Arianna Tassinari, who's Max Weber Fellow at the European University Institute, where she conducts research on comparative political economy, industrial relations, social policy, labor market regulation. But Arianna is also a social activist, a member of the research collective Il Cantiere delle Idee, which is a collective that conducts critical public-facing sociological and political research on Italian society, but also on international issues. So this was an overview of our speakers, and really I will just leave the floor to each of you. As already Vincenzo said, we have a first round of intervention, 10 minutes each. And basically, I mean, the question that we will ask you, it's a very general and open question, because we would be very interested in listening to your view on the challenges that you have primarily experienced and those that have emerged in your field of action and organizing, and how you have reacted to them, what kind of responses have been put in place to those challenges. So I think we keep the order as it is on the flyer, I would say. So we can start from Daria. And of course, if you want to add anything on your short bio information that I made, please feel free.
Yeah, do you hear me? Hello?
Yes, 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 yes.
Yeah, I guess, so the question is how the recent Corona situation affects our work, the union movement. I would say, in a way, definitely, something that I could add to your description is also that I'm a union negotiator. So I work a lot with some kind of an external organizer, helping people to navigate in organizing a workplace. But also I represent sometimes, or together with the members, negotiate with bosses in the negotiation table. And something that I definitely noticed recently is that this is becoming a very common argument in negotiations, especially when it comes to damages. For example, if an employer is supposed to pay some damages for breaking the law or firing somebody, they would bargain about it because of the Corona. So they are like expecting the union movement to understand and kind of adjust to the situation and kind of put down their demands in a way. And I think this is an expression of something that is very common now in general. Otherwise of that, just to keep myself short, I guess, because we are many, I work mostly with migrant workers, and here it's kind of interesting to see, but the situation didn't really change for me. Like, I don't see much difference, because when it comes to migrant workers, as soon as they start to organize, there is repression. And I didn't see any more repression than it usually happens. And another thing that's specific to migrant workers is very often they work with very unsecure employment forms, 0 hour working contracts. And here, of course, people are being fired, but it's not more than I usually notice. But to give some positive ending to this comment is also that I think for many workers that are essential, and especially migrant workers that I work with, I think the Corona pandemic, it's also a very good situation to put up their demands. Since many of the borders in many countries are actually closing, which is not positive, but in many branches that for example, agriculture workers and food production workers that I work with a lot, this industry is going to be missing around 8,000 workers this year, coming from basically Eastern Europe to Sweden, who usually do bear picking, like working with food production. And this puts them for once in a good position of actually putting their demands forward, because there's nobody else who's going to do that job here. So it's an interesting time, definitely.
Okay, Thank you, Daria. You also save some minutes probably for next intervention if you want. Yes, Dora.
Hi guys, so I'm Dora, as Andrea told you, and I've been working as an actress for the last 20 years. Before I tell you how coronavirus affected all forms of performing arts, art and artists in general, I have to tell you some things about how the situation was in Greece, just to tone that it has become really, really bad. So since 2010, that Greece was put under strict financial surveillance by a memorandum that was signed by the Greek government with the European Union. So we found this 10 years of economic austerity, like half of the population, perhaps even more, lost 50% of their monthly wages. The first profession really who was affected by it was artists. And this is not strange because we're talking about a profession that is very unstable, that has most of the time unpaid or underpaid work. Sometimes since 2008 and onwards, we found in the theater, especially that I am working mostly, a new way of salary that was with percentages according to earnings, as opposed to a monthly wage. So if there were like 20 people in a production, which is not rare for theater companies, so this X number would be divided between them. So they would take, I found myself in 2010 earning 200 euros for a show that I was working for 3 months. The other distinctiveness about Greece is that we're not paying rehearsals, and rehearsals are the most time that an actor has to commit to a production. So it's the least you can have for a production is 1 month, and the most is 4-6 months. So you have to imagine for 3 months in total not being paid by anyone and by nowhere. Also, since 2013, we abolished the employer union contract that we had. Our union, in general, in Greece, the actors union has been more of a decorative body, really. And it hasn't been, and we have lost faith in it because it hasn't been standing for our labor rights and was not promoting our needs. So that's why it became it didn't have any strength. It became very weak. So nobody really pays attention to it anymore. So we have a representative body, but it's as if we don't have one. The other thing is that we don't have collective labor agreements. So, which means that many producers are not obliged to pay national security contributions. And that leads to not having social security, not being able to get a pension at a certain point, and so on. So in this environment that was so unstable for actors, coronavirus brought really a gravestone. So since the 14th of March that everything was shut down, and it was the last date that theaters and actors worked, and that is for musicians as well, for all forms of performing arts. The actors have taken as an allowance and as a support allowance by the Greek government 800 euros. That is for 1.5 months. And when the lockdown was over and people started going back to a normality and all professions started slowly going back, we are the last with not knowing what will happen. At the moment, we're told that all summer productions are canceled. And as you understand, for a country like Greece, who's huge and most prominent product, export product is culture and tourism, that's a huge slip. So we have ancient open theaters that we brought concerts and dance and dance productions and theater productions to life. And now all these productions, more than 200 productions during summertime, are canceled. And also the winter period that starts from October onwards and goes up to the Great Easter, which is up to April, is also in thin air, because with the new regulations regarding theater capacities, like according to how many people you can fit in theater, many producers said that they're not going to be able to sustain a new productions when you only have like 60% of the capacity of the theater and paying a ticket that is 15 euros most. So that is the situation. Of course, there is a lot of all this situation between artists brought to life the support artist, the support art workers, which was really at the beginning, it started as a platform on Facebook that really promoted dialogue and exchanging thoughts about the profession in general. But it spread its wings more on social subjects, and it became really it became a movement, a social movement that at the moment counts more than 23,000 members. So I think the need for people in art that all these years they have been very introvert and very immune really to general social fermentations that was happening in this country because of the 10 years of really strict austerity measures, became like they in a way, for me, it's the first time that artists became aware and got a self-identity, which is people that are in the production line and they are workers, as the word says it. Because for many years, artists in general, and I think in Greece in particular, they were very much into this vague kind of, we're artists, we are the selected ones, we're not very much close to other professional fields. So now we have been in the dark, and now our problems, the problems that have been going on for so many years in this field, have been brought to the surface and to the light. And also what we call that the people, like other professional fields, that is our audience in a way, they became aware that we as well are people that have been struggle with like bad professional and working circumstances. So in a way, although it seems very insecure, the day tomorrow and the day after tomorrow, and what we're going to do, are we going to be jobless for one more year? I think that it has spread into a very strong social movement that is been endorsed by also younger colleagues, which is very promising in itself. And we're just going day by day because everything changes day by day. So, so that's the situation here. At the moment, I was on to work in winter, and 2 days ago, I received a call from the producer saying that, you understand, I cannot do it, this, that, and the other. So I find myself not having work at all. And just, having to wait for an allowance that the government will give us. It's not dignity. Nobody should go through this. That's it.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I mean, of course, already in these two interventions, I could see a lot of similarities and differences that come together, from instability of work to the impossibility or difficulties in predicting what will happen. But at the same time, some insights on possible directions to take that came both from Daria and from you, Dora. So I now give the floor to Valentina.
Okay, here we go. Thank you very much for the invitation. First of all, good evening to everyone. And well, I try in pills to give you a little bit the idea of what was the impact, or at least, I mean, how we organize in this phase. In Italy has trade unions, and especially has metal workers. As already Andrea said, I'm a representative of FIOM, which is the largest metal worker trade union. And I'm, yes, in charge of the European relations, so I'm in contact, and I was in contact, and still I'm in contact in these days, also with other trade unions in Europe, trying to organize together a common response, because this is the huge part that we'll have in the second, I mean, in the next future. So how to mobilize together. But I'm also, and I say this because it gives you the sense of how I was directly involved. I'm also part of the local board of our trade union. So that means that I directly follow some working places in some companies, and mainly on the national ICT companies, which were the most likely one, because they couldn't continue to work in this so-called smart working, which is not smart working at all at the moment. This is one of the biggest themes we have. Basically, people are stuck home, working from home, which is very different from having independent work and or being able to work from where you want and to freely organize your work. In Italy, what happens? So, I mean, if you give a look at the timeline, we started from the end of February when we have the first cases, and then everything is divided into different phases. But basically, what was the beginning? The beginning was the starting in the north of the pandemic, and the big increase of people who were turning sick, and the huge amount of people who have died in the first weeks. What led to the first legal provision who has blocked all the schools in Italy, and then after all the activities, I mean, all the possibility to move around the country. By the very beginning, I mean, there was a lot of list of things that were very specific. You were allowed to do or not. They were really specific about the fact you could go outside with the dog or not, but at the beginning there was nothing provided for the workers. I mean, it was very clear that it was everything really unsafe outside, and you should avoid to move. And there was this kind of narrative in which if you were outside working, two people together, you were sort of spreading the virus around, a sort of social killer, but you were allowed to work in a plants with 4,000 people. So the first impact to us was to reconquer a list of pillar to protect the workers. So it was not for granted. I mean, they had a provision, but they were not for the working life. So we started to strike. That was, as usual, the first reaction you can have. So we started with a week of strike. We were forced because the workers were feeling unsafe in the lines, in the working place. They were striking to ask an extra distancing on the assembly lines, for instance, and for asking for the personal protection equipment that was not sufficient or distributed in the working places. So that was the beginning. Try to put in safe the workers. Then we realized that there was a very big lack of personal protection equipment, and that's so far and there was also the issue of the transportation. Of course, you can distance people inside the plants, but at the end of the day, there is the problem of how do you go there? So if there is not a potentiation of the means of transportation, then you continue to have people stuck inside the underwear on buses, because not everyone is able to go to work by their own. And so we arrived to ask the government to stop, that was the trade union. So that somehow you can think it's illogical, but it was us that we asked to stop the production. And we asked it because we thought that we should concentrate all the effort to also with the equipment that was disposable in this moment for the very essential activities. After the first part with the first wave of strike, also wildcat strikes we had in the countries, that basically was the metal workers and the riders, but I would say that was the major contribution. We managed to sign a memorandum of understanding. So this was also something very important that was also updated end of April. So we signed under the patronage of the government, together with the employer association, which has been very, very aggressive since the beginning, of course, because they were completely against the closures of the working places, and well, of course, we're attacking the provision, but we signed a memorandum of understanding in which we were able to do to establish each working place a sort of council formed by the employers, the representatives, and also the representative on health and safety. That was very important, because as we had some provisions for, national provisions, then you have to decline in each working places. So you have to imagine that if you are a white collar or a blue collar, it depends on the production you have to have different provision that you have to take into account, and different measures. So this is a very, very important part of our work, trying to somehow fix the measures for the safety of the workers. And the second one, of course, was all the discussion related to the salary contribution. So you have to imagine that once the production has stopped, there were financed for the so-called independent worker. There was a contribution of 600 euros per month, which is nothing, and most of them they haven't received. It was very problematic to them. And then, but then we had the financing a sort of, we have, how to say it in English, it's a sort of standby unemployment scheme. We call it Cassa Integrazione, which allowed you to stop to work and you have a compensation, of course, with a maximum of 1,100 euros. But you have to discuss it. You have to discuss it with the company. They were allowed to ask it for 9 weeks to cover the slowdown of the production or the stop of the production. But of course, here, even the point is that government, any institution of the government will pay you this amount. But if you don't have a trade union who's bargaining the fact that it's the company who anticipate this part of the salary, then you are in the case with thousands of workers are now in Italy that you are still waiting the contribution for the last weeks. So you can imagine that the condition of poverty and the working poor has increased massively. Of course, we think that this is an horizontal theme. I mean, it's arrived in a pandemic and it affects everyone, but the affection is not the same for everyone, because if you are a woman stuck in a home, of course, it's not the same. If you are working poor, it's not the same. And last things, and then I try to be brief, and then I say more things after if I have the chance. Also related to what was Andrea saying before, about, it was mentioned the relation with Blockupy, and then I will come back about the need of alliance for the next stage of the situation. But also what was saying Daria about the migrant workers here in Italy. What it has happened is that a lot of invisible workers have become visible. So this is somehow an opportunity that it comes for migrants workers, in which there were some intervention by law that were not sufficient, but at least there were some first steps. And also, I would say, this whole narrative around, you know, the saver working inside the hospitals who have been, you know, externalized during these years, who are working not in I would say, marvelous conditions. So, I mean, starting from the narrative of the pandemic, I think that there is a sort of window of opportunity, in our sector to rethink the production. So, in a situation in which not everything can go on like it was the day before, if you think at the automotive sector or the mobility sector, I mean, everything has changed from one day to the other with a loss of production of the 95%. Then there, if you have to take initiatives, so it's the moment to I think, discuss collectively which initiative we need to take. But I will come up later on this if I have the possibility. Thank you.
You will definitely have the possibility. Thank you. I think, thanks a lot also for your intervention. That you mentioned this issue of the narrative, that it's quite important also to discuss from our perspective. Now, you said that not everyone has been affected in the same way, and this was this is an important counter narrative that it's important to bring up, because as you said, generally speaking, it sounded as everyone was affected in the same way, but we are already learning from 3 different sectors that the pandemic has not impacted in the same way, not even in the world of work. So now I will give the floor to Dave from the UK. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And first of all, once again, I'd like to thank you for the invite for coming and talking to people. I'm going to concentrate on the construction industry in the UK and what's been going on there, really, and one of the more grassroots rank and file campaigns that I've been involved in that's basically set up and we've been involved in over the last 10 or 11 weeks. First of all, construction, very similar to what Daria was talking about in Sweden. You know, we're talking about big sector, you know, millions of workers working in it, but virtually the entire workforce being classified by their employer as self-employed. So on precarious contracts, if they're dismissed, they can't take any claims to court for unfair dismissal because of the way the legislation works in the UK. Very, very limited employment rights, very short-term contracts anyway. And to do with coronavirus, the scheme that the government set up to pay people wages, 80% of their wages if they were sent home from work, doesn't apply to self-employed workers. There is a separate scheme, but it took 9 weeks for anyone to get any money from the self-employed scheme. So, you know, you had this situation where construction wasn't one of the sectors that was automatically closed down. Shops were closed down, theatres were closed down, restaurants and bars were closed down, but construction was allowed to carry on working. And the vast majority of the workers, if they decided to self-isolate, wouldn't have got any money whatsoever. So effectively being forced back into the what they considered to be unsafe workplaces. So there's the precarious contract thing that was mentioned by all of the speakers before. Dora and Daria mentioned it. But the other thing that Daria mentioned also was the victimisation. And the construction industry in the UK is I would say infamous for victimisation of union activists. About 10 years ago, a government department actually found the illegal blacklist that the major employers used to keep on construction workers who campaigned for the union or raised concerns about health and safety. And all the big multinationals, all of the ones that not just in the UK, but all across Europe, whether it be Skanska, whether it be Sir Robert McAlpine, Carillion, Vinci, Lang O'Rourke's, all of these were involved in this blacklisting, unlawful blacklisting of union safety reps. So you've got a situation where you've got precarious workers. Anyone who stands up for their rights is likely to be sacked. And the industry's got the worst health and safety fatality figures of any industry in any sector in the whole of the UK. And so when this all kicked off, the government said, okay, construction can go back to work, but it has to go under certain guidelines. And what they did is they asked this organisation called the Construction Leadership Council, which is basically made up of all the big multinationals, the heads of all the big multinationals, to draw up the safe procedures. And they're called the Standard Operating Procedures, and they are published on the official government website. That if you go on the UK government website, they tell you that you can work in construction by following these procedures. And you know, by no big surprise, all of the big construction companies have written these procedures, and it effectively says that social distancing will operate as long as the task, but if the task requires it, we don't need to do social distancing. There's been 4 versions of this because it's been watered down every single time over the last 10 weeks. And the latest version basically says construction, if the task requires it, construction workers can work face-to-face all day. There's no time limit from working. And so therefore you've got loads of workers forced back into this situation. And if I'm honest, I think a lot of us, I'm a trade union activist, like lots of people in this room, lots of us, when it first happened, I think it was almost like a bit of a jolt. So what do we do? You know, it's not how we normally operate. But really, this is just good old-fashioned union organising, but just with slightly different methods. You know, we haven't gone back. You know, we still have to organise. We still have to talk to workers. And the methods that we started talking to people to start off with was Twitter. There was a hashtag started on Twitter, not by any of the union activists, but by workers on building sites and their partners, and the hashtag was "Shut the Sites," and it was just everywhere. Every time you turned on Twitter, the people were talking about it. They were talking about it on TV, and the union activists grabbed hold of it. And within a week or so of the pandemic starting and the lockdown in the UK starting, we'd organised. You know, I think we set up a Facebook page which had about 2,000 people join it like within 24 hours, and then. What we've been really pushing for people to do is not individually go to their employer and ask for things. We're trade unionists. We believe in collectivism. We believe in people doing stuff as a group. Is whether you're in a union or not in a union, because the majority of the workforce in construction probably are not in the private sector of construction, are not in the union at all. But to get people to do things to collectively, get the co-workers together and raise things with their employer collectively. Obviously, we're encouraging everyone to join the union, but I think the key thing was to have some kind of collective strength, whether they're in the union or not in the union. And from Twitter and Zoom and making videos, what we've been pushing is to try and organise some kind of collective action. And for a short period of time at the beginning, it worked very, very well. So the biggest biomass plant anywhere in Europe, it might be anywhere in the world actually, is in northeast England at the moment. It's the MGT biomass plant that was closed down. Over 1,500 workers shut that job down, and everyone was sent home on full pay. Quite a lot of other big infrastructure projects were sent back. We had, you know, once again, small little feedbacks from individual groups of workers on small little jobs, pushed it. And what we've been trying to really push to people is just because there's social distancing and just because there's lockdown doesn't mean we can't do union organising. We still have to carry on doing union organising. We still, if necessary, we have to protest. And that's the thing that we've been trying to encourage. And I think that the Black Lives Matter stuff has just shown, I think, that the world is ready for protest again. You know, if it needs it, we need to protest. However much, you know, as a safety rep, I'm sort of biting my tongue a little bit about social distancing. You know, workers are prepared to come out and do it if need be. And I'm just going to quickly do one little thing before I shut up. In fact, I've spoke for too long already, so I might do this on my second bite of the cherry. We've been making lots of campaign and protest videos that we've been pushing out, not as an alternative to doing union organising, but as a way of inspiring people and give people some sort of tips and ideas about what they could do themselves. So I'll finish my bit now. I might show that back when I have the second bite of the cherry later on.
I think Dave, you can do that. I think you have some time left, so please go ahead.
We'll show it now.
Yeah, if you want.
Okay.
If you want, I mean, you have a couple of minutes on the time schedule, but it's up to you.
It's nice, and I'll show it later. I'll let other people.
Okay.
Later.
Good. Yeah. Thanks a lot, Dave. I think interesting. I mean, I think it's extremely interesting so far to see different sectors and different strategies that could be undertaken in different sectors to be displayed, to be told in this occasion. Yeah, sorry. Arianna, thank you. Go ahead. Now the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Andrea, and thanks to the whole Moving Labor Collective for the invitation. So my name is Arianna, and I am actually not a trade union organizer, although I would like to be, but I am primarily an academic researcher, and I work on labor issues, sociology of labor movements, and political economy of industrial relations. And today, I'm mainly going to talk about one of the sectors that I have been studying most closely during the last few years, which is that of the gig economy, and specifically the food delivery segment of the gig economy, and give a little update on what have been some of the main issues that the pandemic has thrown up in the sector, especially with regard to the Italian context where I am living at the moment, and where I have ongoing contacts and collaborations with networks of activists in various cities. So a little bit like some of the other speakers have already said, a lot of the issues that the COVID-19 pandemic has brought up in the segment of the food delivery industry in the pandemic are essentially exacerbations of many issues that were already there beforehand, and that emerge in all their problematic character, during in a time of crisis. So essentially, the main battleground on which the struggles of food delivery workers in the gig economy in Italy have been focused on already for 3 years or so concerns, like in many other countries, the issue of their legal status and classification as self-employed or dependent workers, and essentially the issue of what is the legal responsibility of the platform towards the workers in terms of guarantees of rights, both in terms of income protection, guarantee of hours, guarantee of minimum payments, access to collective bargaining, and so on. And in Italy, there has been, an ongoing process of mobilization from below already for the last 3 years that has led to some significant advancement in terms of some of the legal rights that food delivery workers hired by platforms are entitled to. So they've had some extension of legal rights that essentially give them some access to similar protections to what independent employees would have, but still this is a long way from being a proper equality of status. And this problem of this misclassification of gig workers as essentially independent contractors emerged in all its problematic characters at the time of the pandemic. Why? Because as Valentina was recalling, the Italian lockdown was characterized by initially a contention over the definition of sectors that were considered essential and therefore were allowed to continue operating at the peak of the pandemic. So, you know, between like the end of March until roughly the end of April. And those sectors that instead were designed as non-essential and where therefore workers could stay home and have, at least in theory, on paper, access to some form of income replacement. And food delivery platforms, interestingly, were designed as an essential activity because they were essentially equated to, you know, last mile logistics services that were fundamental for guaranteeing the continued operation of other sectors. So in a sense, they're kind of like a key auxiliary service that allowed, especially the food and drink industry, the hospitality industry, to at least continue to partially operate under the lockdown by having the service of home delivery. So food delivery platforms were especially, like, specifically designated as essential. And this meant that essentially the technically like self-employed workers that, you know, are that operate for food delivery platforms could not have access to, you know, the kind of income protection schemes that were available for workers in non-essential sectors, right? And therefore, there was a very strong coercion to actually continue working in order to be able to have access to any form of income, which is very ironic, you know, if you actually compare it with, you know, the rhetoric of flexibility and choice that usually surrounds the discourse around platforms. But actually what emerged really, really clearly in this case was that there was, you know, it was like the epitomization of like the coercion to continue to go to work even under very unsafe conditions, because otherwise there was literally no access to any other form of livelihood for many of these workers. And what was also very, you know, and this in a sense was not new, because the theme of health and safety had already been brought up for a very long time by food delivery workers in the Italian context, like in many other Italian countries, like many other European countries where mobilizations have been happening. Like the fact that employers, or like the platforms, by pretending not to be employers essentially, have been trying for a very long time to eschew their responsibility to provide proper health and safety protections. And before the pandemic, this related to things like, you know, bike helmets, lights, but also to, you know, the adaptation of the procedural, the operational procedures of the platform in specific occasions. For example, in cases of bad weather, right? Like, you know, the platforms essentially completely outsourced the physical risk of carrying out the work activity, even under dangerous conditions, to the workers, using the pretense of the fact that essentially they didn't have, you know, an employer role. And this happened in the same way, in a very similar way, also during the context of the COVID-19 emergency, in the sense that many platforms did not provide any kind of personal protective equipment to their workers who were continuing to, you know, operate at contact with the public. They did not adapt in any way, like the sort of operational procedures in order to allow workers to like protect themselves physically. So, for example, you know, how to hand over food to the customers, but also how to wait outside of restaurants. Like this was all completely left to the individual responsibility of the workers themselves, which obviously put a lot of them under very risky circumstances, because a feature of the Italian context, which I think is not unique in relation to, you know, the broader landscape of platform work, is that a lot, despite, again, the rhetoric being one of this being a job done, you know, by students on the side just to complement their income and so on, actually what we know from like the research that has been done and also the organizing effort that have been done is that a lot of workers in these sectors are actually like predominantly migrant workers, like at least 60-65% according to the statistic that we have on Italy, very vulnerable, often actually, you know, and even operating potentially under situations of like, you know, illegal gang master type of labor intermediation. So you have a very vulnerable workforce with limited access to, you know, even knowledge about what their rights could be, and very limited channels to, you know, exercise their rights. What has been very interesting has been that so against this very problematic background of, having to essentially continue operate under very potentially dangerous circumstances with the platforms eschewing their responsibility for the provision of even the most basic equipment, what we see, as we kind of would expect, is that in those cities where there had been previous experiences of organizing and mobilizing by food delivery workers, actually the riders were able to fairly quickly mobilize in order to put pressure on the platforms and extract some important steps forward in terms of upholding of their rights. So, and what is also very interesting is that this has happened through a variety of channels. So in some cities, such as like Milan, Turin, Bologna, there were like some sort of mobilization from below, like either kind of like spontaneous strikes or flash mobs, or mobilizations online and in the streets with like the gig workers using specific hashtags to kind of like mobilize public opinion, using tactics that they already used in the past in previous mobilizations. And this mobilization of public opinion was, had some, was helpful for reaching some important concessions. So, for example, Just Eat, one of the main platforms, started providing personal protective equipment to the riders after a massive campaign that was sort of launched by the workers. But also what was really important was the combination of these mobilizations from below with the use of the legal channels to essentially force the platforms to kind of take some responsibility as employers. So in this case, the first case was a rider in Florence that supported by essentially the atypical workers branch of CGIL, so NIDIL, so the same trade union that FIOM, the union from where Valentina was speaking about, is affiliated to. So the Confederation supported this worker in essentially launching a legal claim that would force the employer, like the platform, to provide personal protective equipment to the workers. And this was successful, and on the basis of this ruling by a judge that essentially recognized, that the riders were essentially operating as employees, Just Eat was forced to start providing personal protective equipment to its riders. So there has been a very interesting combination of tactics, which includes mobilization from below and use of the legal channels wherever available. The problem, as always, remains one of very patchy implementation. So because the confines of the gig workforce are very porous, and there are essentially a lot of also gray areas in terms of how people come in and out of the sector. Even in those cases where, in theory, the platforms were obliged to provide personal protective equipment or, implement some kind of health and safety norms, the implementation on the ground remains extremely patchy, and it's really, really difficult both for unions or for workers' collectives to monitor, and for workers that are already in a vulnerable situation, especially migrant workers that might not have knowledge of their rights, to be able to exercise them. And the very physical dispersion of the workforce on the terrain of the city makes it really, really hard, even for like labor inspectors or any kind of interventions, to have really a clear sense of what is the the implementation of the norms on the ground. So I would say that I'm gonna close now and come back to the issue later. But I would say that what I think the food delivery experience in Italy highlights is that, in a sense, in those cases, like without conflict and without a previous infrastructure of organizing, it's really, really hard actually to like make rights have strength and legs to work on. And I think this really proves like the importance of doing the kind of like organizing work in non-crisis times, because when the crisis hits, you really need those organizing infrastructures already in place to be able to exercise the right and like essentially demand forms of protection and guarantees. So I'm going to stop here for now.
Yeah, thank you, Arianna. And it's also, it's a very good way to end the intervention, because it links perfectly with what Dave said right before you, that, I mean, there is need to organize. And of course, you say that it's important to organize also in normal time, not only in time of emergency as it is this time. Yeah, I mean, I think that so far already there are many issues that have been touched. And we are doing also very good on time, which is always an important aspect to consider. I mean, as already Vincenzo and I said at the beginning, there will be a second round in which our speakers will be asked to reflect upon possibilities for future work, and for yeah, how to like imagine new ways of work on organizing workers. But before that, so I would like to open the floor for 2-3 questions maximum, and possibly focusing on aspects that you would like to be clarified concerning this round. So please do not ask questions about future work, because that will be the second round of question. I see that there is already someone, and you can ask question by just writing on the chat. And I mean, you can write your question, but I can also give you the floor. You can unmute yourself and ask directly the question. I see that there is Beryl that would like to ask a question.
I think it's better, since it's just Beryl, I think it's better if Beryl unmute herself and ask the question.
Okay, thanks. Thanks for giving me the floor. Also, thanks for organizing this. It's very interesting to speak to people from the field as well. Some of you may know I'm a musician myself. Fortunately, I don't depend on the income anymore, but I'm still part of a big group here in the Netherlands. So I wanted to ask Daria, sorry. Dora, yeah, I was right. Here we have a new debate about whether we should have basic income to partly capture some of the vulnerability that is inherent to the job of an artist. Do you recognize this? Do you have any of those debates as well?
Well, yes, I was trying to write you down my answer. Yes, at the moment, we are in the streets, really. Artists are in the streets, are having constant meetings. We're having constant meetings between us to ensure like a minimum of wage, at least for the months that we're going to be out of work. The problem in Greece, and I assume that it's not only here, but it's in maybe a wider problem, is that we're not united. Because there's still people that are working as in national institutions that have already decided that they're going to go out with 2 productions. So there's always people that are more famous than others. So, and they were supposed to lead all this wave, but they're not. So I think that I don't want to be bringing bad news, but I think that all this try and all this kind of fight that has emerged because of the COVID-19 is going to fail at the end, because artists, unfortunate, they don't know the road. They are spoiled. They haven't had, there was never the need for them to go out. So now they're very naive in the way of fighting for the rights, in a way. They're very kind of fearful. So although we are doing this, and also you have to understand that we have a government that is extreme neoliberal, coming out from a very strict 10 years of austerity, and also artists originally it's selective base. So I've been saying this because if we were a professional field that where it's elective based, they would be more generous with us. But we're not, artists are not. They're much more left-wing, originally in Greece here at least. So I think that we're just being fooled around. They have been given 15 million of euros to art. This is the lowest rate in the European Union. It's only the 1% of the money that is being given to different fields. So with 95% of unemployed people, like more than 7,000 unemployed actors at the moment, plus other members of the performing arts, I think it's more than 15,000 people that are not going to have work in the following 6 months to 1 year.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I don't know if you want, Dora. You thanks for the reply. So I have collected 2 more questions, and then sorry, we have to move to the second round, but there will be more time afterwards. So just hold on, and you will be given the floor. I see that there is a question from John Logan. I don't know if you would like to unmute yourself and take the floor, or should I read it?
Whatever you prefer.
Yeah. Sorry?
You prefer.
Yeah.
You want me
if you want, yes.
just on the gig workers in general and food delivery in particular, I was wondering if there's been any effort to pass legislation that would make it easier for them to organize, if that's an issue in Italy. I follow it a little bit in the UK, but particularly in the US and California, where I'm based. We have passed legislation, but the Uber and the other gig platform companies are fighting it. So just wondering about similar events in Italy. Thank you.
Thank you, John. So the question was for Ariane, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, essentially, I think like in the broad debate around the classification of gig workers and their misclassification as independent contractors, I would say, has been a characterizing feature of their mobilizations in almost every country where these have emerged. So there have been demands for reclassification as employees, or at least basically a recognition of their subordinate status in Italy for sure, also in Spain and in the UK context, as you were also recounting. And what is interesting about the Italian case specifically is that one of the main demands that the workers have been leveraging for many years, as well as their reclassification as the recognition of their status as subordinate dependent workers, essentially is also the application of a collective bargaining agreement at the sectoral level, because in the Italian context, this is still recognized as one of the main actual sources of proper guarantees and proper also collective representation. And so this has been one of the main demands, and is as of yet one of the issues on which there is a lot of resistance from the platforms, and that remains unresolved. So that passage also from the individual right to the application of actually a framework of collectively bargained rights that don't come only from legislation, but that also recognize a role for collective bargaining at the sectoral level has been one of the main demands. And in theory, well, according to the latest developments, it's something that should have been solved through a process of negotiation between the parties by autumn 2020. Now, it probably looks quite unlikely that this will happen, considering how up in the air things seem at the moment. But there might be some significant developments in terms of, if that comes through, it would be a very, very big step change.
Okay, thank you, Arianna. There is another question for you, actually, that I will read from the chat, and the question is from Bianca Luna Fabris, who's asking to you if you think that the alleged gang mastering offenses that have been recently moved towards Uber Eats Italy will modify the way in which the riders mobilize. That's the question. Yeah.
That's a very interesting question, Bianca. Thank you very much for posing it. And I'm actually not sure myself. I think like it would, well, I can probably see like two main implications. Like the first one, I think, is that it has, I mean, I think the riders that have been mobilizing have always been very self-aware of the issue of like segmentations within the workforce, right? And like they are very aware of the challenges of like including vulnerable migrant workers in their organizing efforts. I think what this sentence might do, which essentially recognizes that Uber Eats, like for those who are not aware of the Italian context, essentially recognizes that Uber Eats has sort of been operating through some essentially illegal gang mastering, illegal, unlawful labor intermediation system. I think what this sentence might do is to open up also a more opportunities for recourse to legal challenges against the platforms and against the operating their operating procedures, which I think might also allow for more established trade unions to leverage their extensive legal expertise against the platforms and some of their more debatable practices. I think it might also open up the potential for new alliances between workers and collectives in the food delivery sector and those organizations that have been working on the issue of gang mastering in other sectors, for example in agriculture, for a very long time, and therefore there might be some interesting forging of new collaborations potentially. But yeah, I mean, I think it's a very interesting question to observe. It's hard to make predictions, but I think it will be, it can potentially open up avenues. Also in terms of framing, I think it exposes very, very clearly, it creates like opportunities on a discursive level for the challenges against the platform practices to become like very easily recognizable and say agreed upon. But yeah, it's one to watch, I would say.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's, as you said, they can create also public opinion, or at least it can increase the exposure of Uber, for instance, and or the other platforms to the public. Now, unfortunately, because I see that there are other questions coming up, but I would like to move forward and with the second round of interventions. And I mean, in preparing for today, we already asked the speakers to somehow reflect on a second round of interventions upon what future responses can be put in place in order to deal with those challenges that you have all highlighted, and also if there are possibilities, opportunities to create, for instance, cross-country dimensions for organizing, or for ACT in particular, and on another end also if and what kind of help, or how do you see that academics and researchers can be of help in achieving your goals. This is more or less the general theme. Then we will have another session of Q&A. So please, Daria, do you want to say something?
You're muted.
Hello, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah. First things first. So interesting to hear all you guys, and also, of course, I want to say something. I want to say so much, maybe too much, but I'll try to get all my thoughts together. Well, something that it's reoccurring with has been reoccurring through all those comments you made is I think it's coming back all the time, and for very very specific and important issue for me, it's the issue of the employment itself. What is employment? What is employer's responsibility? And how does it change? And how does it, what possibilities actually there are for union organizing? I think I've been thinking about it a lot, both through like a perspective of organizing with migrant workers and also a little bit legally. And I think something that it's interesting for me, especially in times of Corona, it's if I'm supposed to find something positive about this terrible crisis, it's that I think it's a time which very, very directly kind of shows the weakness of the system that we have, and the weakness and kind of the unsustainability of the development of the labor market, that will like lead to social insecurity, economical differences, more class division. And here it's on many levels, and on structural level we can see, like in Sweden we had a little bit different situation. Here many of the enterprises actually were opened, and for me, a person working with migrants, again, you could really see who has to work, like people in transport, cleaners, apparently, especially even in the private homes. Rich people still need to get their homes clean, even when they're not working. Transport workers, building sector, agriculture and food production, and so on, so on. Here already we can see a division of class, ethnicity, that divides us, who gets in the risk, who can stay away and work from home. And also it kind of showed, for example, for the Swedish citizen, and many people have the picture of Sweden as being quite a developed welfare state. It showed how people with unsecure employment status have actually nothing to fall back on, because the system, the welfare system, is absolutely not adjusted to 0-hour contracts, short contracts, self-employment, and they're just not compatible. So if you're a 0-hour contract worker, or if you're precarious any other way, not only you're getting hit by the crisis the hardest because you're the first one that's easier to get rid of, but also you have nothing to fall back in form of social security, insurance, unemployment insurance, or sometimes you cannot even go to hospital. So here already we see who's actually paying for this crisis already. And what is interesting for me here, it's going back to the question of responsibility for that. And what we've been seeing, Ariana, you were talking about like gig workers and how they fight to being recognized as workers, not self-employed. I think this is something, that specific situation gives us also a little of I don't know, it's bigger than that. It's not only that sector, of course, the whole precarious sector, the short-term employments, the trainee employments, the 0-hour contract employments, the individualization of work relations makes everybody believe that it's a contract, it's something that it's done by free will. And at the same, and here we have a lot of contradictions, because at the same time it's a free will, you're responsible for your own employment, you can choose to be employed 0 hour, or you choose not. At the same time, the right to strike in Sweden is restricted, so you're free to get this shitty contract, but you're not free to protest when you don't like it. And more and more contradictions are building up. And I think also especially to general public, if we're talking about narratives, how we have to change our way about thinking about the whole thing. It's just shows so quickly here in the corona times how big companies are very good at privatizing profit but socializing the risks. And the development that we see is that actually those kind of contracts, those kind of employers kind of hiding from any kind of responsibility for employment, or it's pushed forward and forward to the extent that more and more people will be soon seen as self-employed. And here I think it's a big and dangerous development that I think should be addressed by general public and talked about more. In general, I think that also this whole, how to say, organizing has a big part in it. But here is like the hard part, because it is hard to organize in many branches when a lot of industries are outsourced. Many of the people work in service now, where they work alone, and it's hard for them to organize, especially when migrant workers, when they are working alone, they don't know language, they're dependent. And here I think we just need to get back to some classic organizing, and especially here a shout out to all the unions that I think could play a big role here, with including the precarious workers, the migrants, the freelancers and artists, groups that maybe normally they don't know how to deal with, because here is the future of organizing actually also. And of course the sectors like transport that are very essential right now, care and hospitals. So I think this, not to make it much longer, I think it brings it all together, that this is like the fight that has to be fought globally, and it's both fight on the workplaces, in organizing, but also changing people's opinion and narrative. And this change of narrative should also apply to everybody working, but also the unions and general public. So here I think this is a good time to bring up those questions, because we see the negative effects of this situation we have now very clear during the corona crisis.
Yeah, okay, thanks, Daria. And yeah, I mean, I guess that everyone who's here agrees with you on the need of organize, and the need to start from the situation that we have. And of course, we all share also your positive attitude.
Yes, I think it's a good time now.
Yeah.
Very visible.
I mean, I agree, because I mean, as all the interventions have illustrated, there are so many changes that could function as platform for new claims, actually. So now, Dora, please. Sorry, I forgot to mention that, I mean, you know already, it's 5 minutes, so that we keep the round short. Thank you.
Okay, so for me, I think that what is going to happen, at least here, is that the situation will clear out. I think that many people will be bound to stopping doing what they are doing, in a way, like stopping being artists or finding something else to do. On the other hand, if we don't disappear as a profession, because it has been a long, also during the pandemic and during the lockdown, I've been catching myself wondering how important are we in a society? Like, the system has gone down. We saw that professions like doctors and people working in stores and the supermarkets were the frontline people that we really needed. And like, I was wondering, where are the golden boys? Where are the bankers now? Who needs them after all? And because we love bank boys and golden boys here in Greece, so this is why I'm wondering about them. So, and I found myself saying that we don't need them that much, you know. So I was wondering the same about for me, like who is going to miss me if I don't play in the theater for a year? Who is going to miss me? The answer is no one, and it's good to know that. On the other hand, I think that artists help people very much psychologically, and they were like a strong component of a psychological uplift during the pandemic. How would all be without the songs on the YouTube and the shows on the YouTube and the different pieces of work of someone's effort, need to express on Facebook if it hadn't been for us. So I think what we are fighting now as a whole, but of course there's never a whole, we're divided into segments, different segments, is that I would say that we should go on a total strike, like taking down anything artistic whatsoever from social media. Not having songs, not having shows, not having no artistic production whatsoever, because there's no other way. There's no other way of you know, trying to make your point clear. So if we're lucky enough, and if we're strong enough, and if we stay united, we might gain something. We might gain something in terms of better and working circumstances, of realizing that we are in the line of a working process with all different professional fields, and that we're not disconnected, we're not excluded, but we're a part of it. And what other people are fighting for in many cases applies to us as well. I think this is a very important component for artists, very important component of putting themselves into society, that they're not something else. They're not living on another planet. It's this planet who is going through shit at the moment, because it's not only the unemployment, it's not only capitalism, it's not only the environment that is being like, we're destroying it. It's so many things we have to fight, and we can't fight it by one being stuck in our own little world, because this is spreading. And if we feel that we are protected by something, we're not. So this is something that maybe it's, you know, maybe a miracle that will happen after the COVID-19. I don't know. But I mean, you know, hope dies last. So that's it.
Yeah, thank you, Dora. I mean, just one comment, because it was very interesting what you said at the end, right? Because there has been several discussions about how the pandemic has brought visibility to workers that are usually invisible. But you represent a category of workers which are very visible and at the same time invisible, because you don't see them working, you see them performing. I mean, there is also a lot of work that is behind the scene. So I think, I mean, this is just a talk. I didn't think about that. So I think it's quite an interesting perspective. Yes, sorry. It's now Valentina's turn.
So thank you. It was a pleasure to hear everyone before. Tried very brief to give another contribution from the perspective of which I live, which is the industry one. I think that this is a sort of, I would say, Darwinian phase in which is a key, the adaptation. And then I start with the easy part. I mean, many of you were referring to the organizing. I think that we find ourselves working a new, with new methods from one day to the others. And of course, I do prefer meeting people. And I had today the first assembly, physical one with the workers. We had all with masks and distanciated. But I mean, it's for sure, I mean, the best way to meet for it at Unionist. But on the other way around, I have to say for the first time, I had the opportunity to convey an assembly for in the ICT sectors in which it's very difficult to have participation. And I had an assembly gathering 500 people. So I have to question myself about which instrument is better, is fitting better. It depends of who I'm addressing. So, but then I think that I really go by points. I mean, the one key point is the organization of work. I think that after years of rhetoric with this lean production, that any moment, any space needs to be filled, now we have been shown that once comes something from the outside, then you have, you know, you have shown that having everything closed will collapse the systems, because it's unhealthy. I mean, it's so toxic. The idea of any production in which you don't have space in between people, in which you don't have time to recover and to rethink and to so I think that this is very important. It's a crucial part for us at Trade Unionists in this moment, is to rethink the organization of work, also starting from I was mentioning before, the smart working. I mean, smart working is not the possibility we are giving now to the companies, because until the day before, I mean, for us, when we were bargaining about it, the question was, no, you cannot work from home, because if you are home, you're looking at the TV. So that was the narrative. And now, as they have, you know, the proof that you're working the triple, because, you know, as if we were in the last century, they are, you know, loading you from work to be sure that you're working. I think that this is not at all the moment in which we have to intend the time, as they will cannibalize also our free time. It's the time on the reverse to say that we need to have a new balance. I mean, now it has been shown how it's important, and I mean, all the work was done into the inside home, who's now is very public because you're working from home. We have to recognize this kind of work, and we have to fight, why not, to the reduction of working time. I mean, I think this is a perfect time to discuss about the working time. Third point is about the economic crisis and the investments. We always say in our sector that the automotive is the signal of the economic crisis. So as I was mentioning before, with the 90% of the production has been stopped because there is now the loss of the demand. I mean, it's not simply because of the pandemic. I think that would be everything more complicated to discuss in the near future. Can you imagine now to discuss about the reduction on CO2 emission with the car dealers full of cars that needs to be sold somehow? I think that this is a very big challenge. And the point is that in that challenge, we have to work close together. And then I come to the investments, which is my last point. It doesn't matter what it would be the Eurobond, the ACB, the Sure Fund, but there will be for sure a massive, you know, billion of euros will go around Europe, and we have to avoid that companies will profit about them without any social boundaries. I make you as an example what will happen. I mean, because employers are already saying, okay, we will receive zero interest monies, or at least in investments, and we will repay by employment or by, you know, paying taxes. I mean, I think this is not sufficient. I think this is also an opportunity to say that as we are, I mean, mobilizing investment, which are public investments, we have to put social issues together. I make you as an example what happens in the transportation for the oh God, sorry, I don't have the name. Flight transportation. I mean, the aerospace here in Italy. It has been in the last decree an amount of 3 billion euros to save the company state, Alitalia, and so on. And what they were able to write, also because of the pressure of the social partners in Italy, is that starting from now, in that sector, I mean, it doesn't depend so hard, but if you are operating in Italy, you are obliged to recognize as the minimum salary the one fixed by the national collective agreement and fixed by the social partners. And so can you imagine, after all the discussion we had with Ryanairs and other, we were not recognizing, you know, in other states, I mean, the collective agreement. I mean, it's an opportunity in the way we are mobilizing resources to say that those resources also have to have a social part. And in this, I conclude saying that the alliance is it's very important. I mean, we cannot, of course, you know, by our own. I mean, we have to be. We have to proceed together. I mean, on the environmental part and discussing on which kind of production do we need, because otherwise it would be, you know, any country discussing one against the other, or who will take the production or who will not. But I think that this is also an opportunity to discuss about which kind of production do we need, which kind of investment do we need, and also for what. I mean, so I think that this is more or less for me the challenges we have in front.
Thanks a lot. I mean, Valentina, this was also very interesting to remind everyone that it's important also to be on the offensive and also to have a clear agenda on what demands need to be put on the table. I will move to Dave now.
Okay, thanks very much. And like everybody else, I've found the discussions really interesting, and some finding out what's happening from sisters and brothers around Europe is always useful. 2 questions were asked to do this next bit, which was, what do we see going forward in the future? And then secondly, how potentially can academics and researchers help in that? And I think the obvious thing that's going to happen in the future, given the hit that's happened to the economy over the last 3 months, is there are going to be massive industrial battles. You know, whenever this finishes, we can see the onslaught coming to us, and if we don't prepare for it now, I think we'll be caught. You know, no one should be caught unawares about the fact of what's going to be thrown at us by the employers and also by the government. And a number of people talked about precarious work and how difficult it is to organise people, whether it be 0 hours contract, bogus self-employment, gig economy. Yes, and I agree. Having, you know, every member of my every male member of my family is in the construction industry, so we've worked through this. It's like a thing that we all know how difficult it is to organise. It's difficult, but it's not impossible. That, I think, is the key point. You know, it's difficult to organise workers who are itinerant, or only on one job for a few months and then go somewhere else for another couple of weeks and go somewhere else, where you know, any union organisation and strength you had gets dissipated. But it's not impossible to do it. And I'm generally very optimistic. I'm a natural optimist, and one of the things that I've found in construction over many years, as part of my research that I've been doing as well, is that every so often, every so many years, every half a generation or so, in the construction in UK at least, there is these rank and file groups that are thrown up, sort of sometimes with low-level lay members of the union, but very often completely from nowhere, and they fight the battles again and again and again that the law says that the unions can't fight. You know, if you're a self-employed worker in Britain, you can't go on strike. The way the law works is it makes it unlawful for you to go on strike because of the way the ballot needs to happen, because who can you ballot? You don't work for the employer. But rank and file networks in construction for many, many years
have led some of the biggest disputes in construction over the last 3 or 4 generations. And I think what's happening now, as I said, the fact that we've got over, nearly 2,000 people have joined a Facebook group literally within 24 hours is giving us that network of people that to take things forward. And to call it shut the sites is, if we can't use that to go forward in the future for mobilisation and organising, I don't think, then we're really missing a trick. And what can academics do? It's about whether I'm an academic purely as a researcher to find new knowledge, or whether I'm there to work for emancipatory change, to assist social movements, to assist the oppressed in a kind of participatory action research sort of model of working to change things. That's why I think it's important. That's why I'm optimistic. And that's why I'm going to finish on just showing you our last little video. We've produced loads of these videos. This is the last one we've produced. So please bear with me while I try and get the technology to work. Right, here we go. Please give me a thumbs up if you can see this. Perfect. Right, here we go.
Anyone who can't work from home, for instance, those in construction or manufacturing, should be actively encouraged to go to work.
What I don't understand is why my daddy has to work on a construction site, working in close contact with other people. He's not a doctor or a nurse saving lives. He's not an essential worker doing essential work.
On the exact same day that the government is forcing construction workers back onto unsafe building sites, the Office of National Statistics has produced figures saying that 3 times more construction workers have died from coronavirus than healthcare professionals.
These body bags are a symbol of how the responsibility has slipped from Boris Johnson's desk onto the shoulders of men with hard hats on construction sites.
We have too many big companies, especially putting profit before lives. That's a breach of their statutory duty of care. Non-essential work such as High Speed 2 is carrying on apace.
The government, the HSE and Public Health England must know that on site and as they travel to and from work, construction workers are exposed to and are unwitting carriers of the coronavirus. In my view, this is criminal negligence, it's manslaughter, it's social murder.
Construction is a notoriously risky business. Accidents happen all the time. But accidents happening now just place increased strain on an already overstretched NHS.
There will be no cliff edge to the furlough scheme. I'm working as we speak to figure out the most effective way to wind down the scheme and ease people back into work. We want to get people back to work, get our economy fired up again.
If the government wants to protect public health, it needs to pay construction workers to stay at home.
Self-employed and agency workers should be paid as well. Nobody should be left in poverty.
We need to get our voice heard. We need to protest, organising collectively to get our message across.
It is ludicrous, but it's like, because we're at the bottom of the pile, they send us to work. I'm not a lab rat, I'm a human being.
My name is Simon Hester. For 18 years, I was an inspector with the Health and Safety Executive under Section 7 of the Health and Safety at Work Act and Section 44 of the Employment Rights Act of 1996, you have the legal right to remove yourself from the workplace if you feel that your health and safety is put at risk, including by the virus.
If you are working on a site, ask for your risk assessment, your COVID-19 risk assessment.
I'm scared my daddy will bring the virus home, scared he will be ill, scared he will make my mummy, my brother ill too.
Don't go in a site and get this fucking thing that's going to kill you and kill your family. Please, please don't do it.
Remember the dead, fight for the living!
My daddy is very important to us.
Okay, thank you, Dave, for this beautiful video. Very, I mean, yeah, I enjoyed a lot, and I think it tells more. I mean, it tells a lot. It was lovely. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yes. So, Arianna.
It's a hard act to follow in a sense because I mean I think in many ways the video that Dave showed like encapsulates so many of so many of the issues around which I think alliances can be built and constructed across countries and across sectors. And I think like what I was going to say is that, I mean, I honestly find it really hard to kind of like make predictions or like draw out expectations of how things are going to play out, because something that I've been kind of struck by in the course of the previous weeks is like how quickly the political terrain on which conflict evolves in the last 3 months seems to shift so quickly. And, you know, like if you think about it, a month ago, like we were in the depth of the lockdown, and it was like really hard to even envisage that we would be having like a mass social movement on the streets of, you know, all European cities on the issues of anti-racism, you know, like as of last week. So I think like we might actually see much more of an escalation of you know, of conflict and a shifting of the terrain, like much more quickly than what would have maybe been thinkable. So I find it really hard to kind of like draw out expectations, but where I definitely see like the, you know, the challenges and the opportunities coming up, like essentially in the, you know, it's around this issue, like the biggest opportunity for me is essentially around this issue of finding common terrains of contestation and of mobilizations across sectors that thus far, or across segments of the workforce that thus far have perhaps mobilized a bit more separately. So I think like, for example, and I think here back to the example of, you know, gig economy workers, which, you know, is what I kind of followed more closely. There has been, to some extent, I would say, a little bit of a danger in the last few years of kind of like gig economy exceptionalism, like, you know, representing the gig economy as if it's like, you know, this like super new thing that like comes across and comes along and like completely brings up a whole host of new issues. There are actually like many of the issues that the gig economy and the way of organizing and the work in the gig economy brings up are actually like long-standing. They overlap a lot with the conditions that workers in a lot of other like more established sector already face. But it was somehow hard, I would say, in a lot of country contexts to kind of like break out of that discourse of, oh, the gig economy is like this shiny new thing that like completely transforms everything. And I think what the reality of, you know, the COVID-19 crisis kind of shows that like some issues are actually very cross-cutting. And I think the very politicization, first of all, of health and safety as a right, and is something that offers a lot of potential for forging like alliances and for realizing communalities that, you know, workers in very different sectors of the situations of works in very different sectors face. And I think that opens up a lot of like very potentially, you know, prolific space for alliances to be forged, and for, you know, the various fragmented realities of precarious workers in different sectors to start like recognizing many commonalities in their situations and potentially working together. I think obviously the transnational dimension is crucial. I would say here is like one of those aspects where, you know, obviously platform workers have been perhaps more attuned to the necessity of transnational mobilizations from early on, from the very fact that like the entities that they organize against are, you know, operating transnationally and often like in rather disembodied, like, you know, they coming in as kind of like these external actors into national configurations of institutions and trying to kind of act as disruptive forces. So gig workers have already for many years like been trying to establish international networks of collectives, and I think you know, this will probably continue, but as always, like, you know, as long as the framework of you know, legislation and trade union action is very much bound within national entities, there is always a little bit this tension that, you know, you try to organize transnationally against the platform, but then actually the concessions that you get are often like very localized, even fragmented at local, even regional level. And so I think that will continue to be a persisting tension, and I guess is like up to, you know, also like union movements that have the capacity to facilitate this kind of transnational coordination to do a lot of that work. But that here is also where I think academics can actually play a very important facilitating role in terms of, you know, translating and amplifying the voices and the issues of what is happening on the ground in individual contexts that we are embedded in or where we do research on, and using our positionality as like kind of like transnational, often transnational workers to facilitate these exchanges and to amplify these voices and to actually help workers in one context perhaps become aware of issues that are similar or that are, you know, different in interesting ways in other country contexts. And I think here is where exactly what Dave was saying, like, you know, this idea of like using our position as academics essentially as a tool of transformation and of emancipation and of like using the privileges that we have in order to amplify and find connections and help trade unions and activists and workers on the ground to see those connections and to build on them. The last thing that I think is important for academia going forward is actually like, you know, to be helpful to the labor movement is to actually start also seeing ourselves as workers and to start taking seriously like the labor dimension of our own work. I mean, so the coronavirus crisis is also posing like a lot of issues on the university sector and higher education more generally, like across a lot of countries. And I think it will be probably a wake-up call for many people for the first time that actually, like, you know, there is a need to also like organize as workers in academia, and that there isn't like a sort of exceptionalism of our own, of the nature of our labor. And I think like the more that we actually start building our own class consciousness as academics, I think the more helpful we can also be as academics of like to the labor movement in terms of actually like recognizing, you know, the common issues. And so I think I look forward to the seminar on academic work, because I think, you know, it's crucial to kind of you know, bring the labor dimension into our own practice as researchers essentially.
Yeah, great point, Arianna. Thanks a lot. I mean, this is really what, I mean, this is a team that is very dear to our collective. So that is a very important, and you know, you're active also on that side on your own. So I think it's very important what you say. It's almost 7. I, of course, thank you everyone, but it's not over. I will now give the floor to Fotis, who will sum up the discussion and hopefully open also for some questions if people want to stay around and if you have time. I mean, there has been so many interesting inputs worth discussing that, I mean, we'll see what happens. Fotis.
Right, thank you, Andrea, and I thank all of you, and I'm really conscious of the time. I don't want Arianna to get locked in her office. So, but at the same time, there are questions that have been raised. So I was thinking perhaps give you the chance to sort of respond to the questions, let Arianna leave, and then I could come back to my conclusion. But I just had one point to make. Having heard Dave and Arianna's interventions and, you know, following on from Andrea's, this is exactly the point of this Labor of Love seminar that will be the last one in this sort of series of seminars. This touches upon this idea of consciousness and self-realization of cognitive workers. And that goes back to a question that was raised earlier by Fuging Chair, and he was addressing it to Dora, about whether or not artists have self-realized their position as workers, whether or not the coronavirus situation actually gave the chance to people that didn't even think of themselves as workers to start thinking of themselves as part of something broader, as part of a movement, as a part of a common experience. And that is exactly the same that has happened with academics and researchers as well. So, as Andrea said, part of the objective of our collective is exactly that, to essentially go back to our own people and sort of realize that we're not living in ivory towers. We're, you know, nothing could be further from the truth, right? We're precarious workers ourselves, and we're very much engaged into social movements. And that ties back to what Dave was saying. What is the point of academia and what is the point of academic research? It's not to create beautiful theories that will be self-reflective and nasal-gazing, essentially. It is about going back on the field, engaging with people, with workers, with, you know, people we live with, and producing research that will be useful to workers, useful to others, that will have an emancipatory effect. So, and to that, I just tapped onto these 2 points to highlight the main objective of the collective, which is, in the end of the day, about becoming a collective, going beyond academia and research. So, but I wanted to raise 2 questions that have been brought in through the chat box. So Dave has actually answered one already: effective and prudent and great, but still I wanted to be heard for reasons of recording. So Dave, do construction workers have a health protocol or any other special regulation during this pandemic to come back to work at construction sites? So it seems that in Argentina, public and private construction was not considered essential at the beginning and was later permitted to work, but under strict health protocols. So the question is, have any new protocols be brought to fore by the English government? You've said already that the situation is fluctuating, is changing on a daily basis. But what is the condition right now?
Yeah, part of this was what I talked about earlier. The government has introduced protocols for people to go to work. No construction was asked to close down at all, whether it be essential work or non-essential work. Everyone accepts that if you're building a hospital or if you're, helping the electricity run, that you have to, that there's key workers there who need to go to work. But the big business, the heads of the multinational construction companies were asked to write the new protocols and the new policies for keeping people safe. And effectively all they've done is just watered down the government guidelines. What they're telling everybody to do in their own homes and when you go outside, they've basically just torn up all them bits that interfere with the construction process. Yeah, we're not particularly. It's been a great thing for mobilising people because everyone's outraged by it, but it's on the official government website. I'll shut up.
Yeah, and sure, but there is actually a follow-up right on that, right? It goes back with health and safety. So Vergis is asking a quick question: as the country is expected to open up further, meaning the UK, and restaurants and other businesses are expected to be opened in the coming days, how do you think this will eventually impact workers' reliance on Sector 44? So how can anybody invoke Sector 44 when in fact you will have to go back to work and get the economy working again?
Yeah, Section 44 is just a piece of legislation in the UK that says if workers feel unsafe in the work environment because there's not enough PPE or there's not enough social distancing or anything, it could be that there's asbestos in the room, that you can withdraw yourself from that job. You're not going on strike, but you're refusing to work in that place because it's unsafe, and your employer, by the law, shouldn't be able to victimise you or discipline you or sack you. Of course, the truth is, we all know that irrespective of what the law says, some employers will still victimise people and some people will still sack you. So it's about everything, about trying to do it collectively rather than doing it individually. I think one individual worker saying to their manager, oh, look, I think this is unsafe, I'm not going to work, is opening themselves up to be sacked. If the group of workers come together and collectively say it to their employer, quoting this piece of law, I'm not relying on the law, I'm relying on the collective action. The law is like a comfort blanket to get people to do things collectively. That's where we should be, putting ourselves in the collective part of it rather than the legal part of it. Sorry to say that to a group of law.
No. That was actually beautifully put. That was beautifully put precisely because of the way that Section 44 is worded. So Section 44 gives the impression that it's up to the worker to believe whether or not, to think whether or not they are safe and express their feelings, their beliefs to their employer. And it is as if they do that, they will be safe. But as Dave said, that's practically further from the truth as it could be. So essentially, the legal advice that's being given to trade unions and individual workers is organized. Don't do anything on your own. Go through your trade union. Go through your health and safety representatives. So Beryl has a question for Dora. So in the Netherlands, artists are raising a discussion to have basic income. Is this discussed among your community? So is there any discussion in Greece going before the government and seeking protection as to the creation of sort of a basic income, a basic standard of income for the artists?
Well, yeah, this is the actual plan, and at the moment we're fighting to bring back again the minimum wage, which will be really achieved by signing an employer union contract that was abolished in 2013. But this is like our intention. We don't know whether we're going to find fertile ground for this. But yes, it's one of the things that we're fighting for. Minimum wage, like paid rehearsals, health insurance, social security obligations being paid by the producer side. So all these things are on the table, and we're fighting for them. What we're going to achieve is really nobody knows.
Right, thank you, Dora. So I don't want to leave anybody hanging out there and still having questions. So is anybody willing to raise any questions that they feel haven't been answered yet? So feel free to sort of raise your hands, drop a text on the chat box. Can't see any raised hands.
Fotis, can I say something last, please?
Yeah, sure.
I was listening to Dave, and I was thinking that this kind of working from home is something that cannot be applied to many professions, like Dave's profession and like my profession. There's a big, like for us, human touch is a huge component of our work. Imagine like watching a show that people will be distant, won't be touching themselves, wearing masks, wearing gloves. We're talking about a thing that is putting our work on a new level, on black waters, on insecure waters. So, and also I think that all this thing that happened during the lockdown with the website and with the any artistic production being able to be shown on a screen is putting people in a situation that wondering like, if I can see a show for free on the YouTube, on Facebook, why should I actually go to the theater or to a concert or to, you know? So this is a thing that it's a huge discussion between us, whether it was okay for us to be giving out so generally all of our work, and whether this new situation that we're experiencing, this new reality, is going to put new grounds on artists in general. So yeah, that was what I wanted to say.
And that is an interesting part of the coronavirus pandemic, right? So essentially, it is exactly that we are realizing the value of work as such, the value of what it is that we do. So all of a sudden, as I think Dora mentioned again, so it became evident that wealth, is born out of the labor of workers. And it became evident that not all workers can be treated the same. Artists are different, construction workers are different, academics are different and perhaps more privileged in a sense. But Vincenzo had a question, so feel free to unmute yourself.
Yes, Dora, my question is very short. How much empathy or sympathy you received during your campaign from, let's say, citizens or the general public or other unions or other social movements? Have you been able somehow to test whether your campaign was somehow reaching the message? Thanks.
Vincenzo, to tell you the truth, it was incredible. When the Support Art Workers platform first shown face on Facebook, in like 1 hour, every person I knew had Support Art Workers on its profile. So it is a broad thing. Like the members, the 23,000 members of the Support Art Workers platform are not only artists, are people that are people who believe that our fight is just. And I think it's the first time that we found allies within the people that have been turning our back to for many, many years. So it was incredible. It was incredible. And it's very touching, because this is the people that we have been leaning on. It's our audience. I was always telling them, these people are paying the ticket to come and see you. This is the people you have to rely on. So I think now this has been growing up until now that we're talking. Like, we had a huge strike on Syntagma Square, and many people came that weren't artists just to support our fight. So yeah, it has been very, very touching. I wasn't expecting it, to tell you the truth, but it was incredible.
Thank you, Dora. There is a question that I think Daria is better suited to answer. So Asma asks, have there been any provisions for migrant workers who are stuck in host countries due to the COVID-19 pandemic, particularly given they're not entitled to many emergency or social protection measures? And so, from the point of view of a Greek labor researcher, there is quite a discrepancy between migrant workers and refugees who are actually doing work in refugee camps and beyond refugee camps. They are still considered to be illegal, so they're essentially flying below the legal radar. And as such, there are no provisions, no protection whatsoever afforded to these people, other than that provided to them by solidaristic groups. And part of the problem during the coronavirus lockdown was that, as mentioned in other countries as well, even though you had to go into public transportation to go work for your employers, if you were a trade union representative, you didn't have the legal right to go out and sort of, help out with the organization of workers, go out and inspect health and safety, go out and help migrant workers that have no other leeway of helping themselves. But I don't know what the situation was in Sweden, for example. So Daria? Daria, I think you have muted yourself.
Of course, yes, hey, thank you. Well, here there's, there's few aspects when we're talking about migrant workers, and we've been doing that through that conversation also. We describe it, migrant workers, as it would be a homogenic group, which is not. Like you say, there is undocumented workers, there is European workers and working in Europe, there's people from outside of Europe who are here. The right to stay, it's kind of conditioned of their working visas. And on all that levels, I could say that we got like a lot of refugees have this possibility to stay in Sweden. Recently they got this possibility, the ones that got refused to stay in Sweden if they have work. Here again, they are being depending on work and their contracts, and I know that it affected a lot of people negatively since they lost their jobs, and therefore they lose even right to stay in the country. Another maybe not so visible or direct way of how their problems of those groups were not addressed with any help from the state is also the gray zone in which a lot of European workers are here, and not only. And this is the people I work with a lot with the agriculture sector and production sector, which has a lot of Eastern European and Southern European workers. And many of them lack social security number, or some are not have been here long enough, or don't have a specific kind of employment to receive, to be obliged, to be able to go on a sick leave or get unemployment insurance. And here is the thing that I'm coming back to, that a lot of people who are the mostly affected don't have any support, any protection, or not even being addressed as a group that needs help. They're pretty much invisible. So that's quite a big problem, I think, here. And I don't know if I answer this question really. Yeah.
And I don't know if it's really possible to answer this question in any conclusion at the time we are in, right? So essentially it's a fluctuating situation, but it's easy because we have talked about narratives.
Oh yeah. Oh, and I have another thing, just very shortly. I'm not a researcher myself, but I've been doing a DIY research. Well, when the corona broke out, I've been following the bigger unions' way of like dealing with the problem, because a lot of these problems were about also information and making the information like accessible, both about the rights, about health environment act and every work environment act and so on. I think there was a big problem with people who don't speak Swedish in Sweden and work, that they didn't get information actually what's going on. And I've been following the bigger unions and their work with that. And actually, like 14 of 17 central unions that organize workers have not prepared any material. And 7 of the unions that specially organize sectors like transport, restaurant workers, production, have nothing in other languages than Swedish, which is also a problem, I think.
Before we wrap up, I want to just say goodbye to Dave, who's about to leave us, has other engagements. Thank you, Dave. As always, brilliant seeing you. Keep up the good work. And I think we should be wrapping up. So Daria's latest points were absolutely essential, right? It's all about providing information, providing support to those that don't have the institutional means to support themselves, or the institutional sort of pathways towards trade unions or established organizational structures. And another thing that sort of comes up out of this discussion about migrant workers is this idea of narratives, right? So it was funny to see, ironic to see in the UK a couple of months ago, the same tabloids, The Sun, The Mirror, that used to be xenophobic and used to lament migrant workers and refugees, all of a sudden hailing them as heroes, because now they are needed to pick up fruit in the UK. So essentially the same media that sort of spearheaded a discussion against migrant workers, all of a sudden seem to be in support of migrant workers. So I'm afraid we did have a last question by, let's see, by Francisco. Francisco, if it's okay with you. Francisco was asking whether or not work from home is going to sort of change the face of work in the future, and how is work from home going to be organized across Europe. And that could be a seminar on its own right. And that is something that we will be discussing to one extent or the other over the next few seminars until the end of the month, so to speak. But for the time being, just let me say a couple of brief words summarizing the discussion that we had over the last couple of hours. So it seems that what the coronavirus, from all of your interventions, seems to have revealed is fragmentation. Fragmentation of experiences of workers, fragmentation of narratives, and fragmentation of legislative interventions. So we have completely different experiences in different sectors, but even within certain sectors, we have this, these narratives being sort of revealed that indicate fragmentation of the categorization of the workforce into the essentials and non-essentials, those who are afforded protection, those who shouldn't be afforded protection, those who are privileged against those who are not privileged. And at the same time, we have fragmentation of legislative interventions. So Dave mentioned, for example, that all of a sudden everybody in construction work in the construction sector was more or less characterized as an independent contractor, and therefore leading to a fragmentation of health and safety protection in that sector. What were the reactions, however, to that exasperation or fragmentation of the workforce, if you will. The reaction is, in my mind at least, and I'm not the most optimistic person out there, it is peculiarly optimistic because it is a moment of self-realization, if you will. So what has come out of this discussion is essentially the, not just the necessity, but what has actually the fact of a new self-realization arising. So the realization of labor and social consciousness of specific groups of workers in specific sectors or under specific conditions. So Daria, for example, mentioned how all of a sudden migrant workers realized that they have value. They not only have value, but they have somewhere to stand upon and push for reform. And at the same time, Dora mentioned how artists all of a sudden realize their own value and the fact that they're not this exceptional sort of category of workers that is disconnected from everybody else. And the same goes for researchers and academics and university workers. So there is this commonality of experience that goes against the narrative of fragmentation. So in the end of the day, this self-realization, this sort of social and labor consciousness that is arising allows for reactions to the coronavirus crisis, but also to how capital has used the coronavirus crisis to be based on this commonality of experience. So essentially you have novel forms of reaction that have used social media to engage with people outside the narrow sector. So what happened with construction workers in the UK, what's going on with migrant workers in various countries, what happened with artists in Greece, engaging with people outside of our own sort of small group and trying to build bridges and solidarity pathways to other groups, and again, realize that there is a way of sort of reacting not within our established institutions necessarily, but even beyond those. And at the same time, we have fragments of novel forms of reaction. So Dave mentioned traditional forms, organizing in your trade union, try to organize a strike. Dora mentioned novel forms, organizing your trade union, but what happens if your trade union has become stagnant? What happens if your trade union is not effective anymore? Well, you either create rank and file organizations, you mobilize on the ground, and you essentially take on the trade union, or you essentially try to sort of push the trade union towards the optimal direction by going sideways, by organizing movements, immediate initiatives at the side of traditional established organizations, and then trying to use those initiatives to push the established organizations towards the directive you want them to go. So all that reveals that things are not as bleak as we want them to believe, perhaps. And that's what I want to take out of all of this. So where do we stand in as academics? Well, exactly as we said a couple of minutes before, and as researchers, we're not disconnected from this, right? We are part of this. We are precarious workers ourselves, and that is the point of this collective. The point is not just to publish our research, not just to cooperate in order to sort of, have beautiful theoretical discussions behind closed doors, but actually to engage with wider population out there, and workers and social activists and labor activists, and sort of build the road ahead. So, and that's exactly what the 3 next seminars are going to do. And that's the last thing from me, is just pitching the continuation of these seminars. So next week, the seminar will touch upon social reproduction in times of coronavirus. So essentially, we will look into those sort of sectors, those categories of workers, like care workers, for example, domestic workers, whose conditions under the coronavirus has effectively exasperated and perpetuated the social conditions so far. They're precarious and disenfranchised status so far. And we are pleased to have confirmed Lydia Hayes from the University of Kent, Natalie Sedaka from UCL, and also, and most importantly perhaps, Ruth Olate, who is organizing with domestic workers in Chile. So she will give us a chance to sort of take the perception of the Global South. On the 22nd of June, we will move to discussing the interconnections between the labor movements and the environmental movement. So essentially, we will be tapping onto the coronavirus common experience, commonality of experience rather, as a blueprint of the commonality of experience that is the environmental crisis, and where the sort of overlaps between these two movements are. And we will conclude at the end of the month by looking into this idea of academia and cognitive work being a labor of love. So essentially, the fact that academics, researchers, and cognitive workers, or artists included, are not considered to be workers, but they're considered to be these sort of exceptional beings that sort of engage in their work because they love doing that, but not because they have the same sort of needs as any other worker does. But for today, I just want to thank every single one of you for participating, and especially our speakers and those who managed to sort of endure until the very end, namely Daria. And I want to sort of thank everybody who sort of stuck around until the end. Please keep in touch with us. Please use our Twitter account, use our Facebook page to come in touch with us, engage with us, because that is the whole point of this. It's not that we're just these like 10, 15 people who are organizing this. It's open to everybody and you can jump on the train. It is a moving train. So take it towards your direction. Thanks a lot.
Fotis, just one last couple of words. Soon we will spread out the information on how to participate to the next seminar on the 15th of June. So you will be most likely receiving our emails. If not, please go to our Twitter account and our Facebook page, because there you will find for sure all information to access as we did for this seminar today. So that was just to complete the full picture of information. And with that said, thanks Andrea and thanks Fotis for very,
thank you, Vincenzo, and thanks
moderating, for moderating this in the best way. Thanks for our speakers and thanks for everyone who took 2.5 hours of their day to chip in and listen and interact with us. Thanks a lot and keep on fighting. See you next week.